Tom. Welcome everyone to the third week of Black History Month and to our session hearing from Roger Klein and the work he's been doing nationally on inclusive recruitment, career progression and race and equality more generally. We will be having an interactive element to the session, but in the meantime, please keep your cameras and your microphones off to enable us to ensure the tech works as well as possible. With that, I'm going to hand over to Tom Gurney, who I'm sure a lot of us know on the call as our CCG Director of Communications and Public Involvement, and previously Tom held the portfolio for the People Directorate in the CCGs as well, so he was very much involved in this agenda. So thank you, Tom. I'm going to hand over to you and then look forward to listening and engaging with the audience as we progress through the session.
Thank you, Nikki, and hello everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be able to host this fantastic webinar today. So this webinar is called Race in the Workplace Beyond the Snowy White Peaks of the NHS. And as Nikki said, this is our latest in our engagement with Black History Month. And hopefully you've had the opportunity to engage with all the events that have taken place. And just want to say thanks to the team for such a fantastic job they've done so far. Really pleased and honoured today to be joined by Roger Klein, and I'll introduce him properly in a minute. I just want to say how Roger has done so much to raise this agenda across the NHS over the last few years, and it is an absolute honour and a privilege to have him as part of the webinar. How we're going to do this webinar is I've got some questions and I'm going to have a conversation with Roger, but it's not just about me asking questions. There is an opportunity for you to all ask questions, and I'll go into how you can do that in a minute. Just on housekeeping, as Nikki said, we've just deliberately decided to do this over MS Teams as like a normal meeting like you do in your workplace, rather than Teams Live. And the reason why we wanted this to be inclusive as possible and interactive as possible. So we are asking that you keep yourself on mute and you do keep your camera off as possible. But then when there is opportunity to have questions, which there will be, and there'll be plenty of time to do so, do raise your hands or put it in the chat box, as you probably do in your day-to-day working. And then lastly, the other thing for me is I know this is predominantly focused on CCG staff, but however, this is a system-wide event, so it's not just about CCG. Really happy that system partners have joined us, and do please ask questions from a system point of view as well as a CCG point of view. So hopefully that's all clear. So I just want to set out a context of this webinar, and I've just picked up a message around it being noisy. So can I just ask that people go on mute if you haven't been able to, and hopefully that will clear up in a second. So across the system and across Sussex Commissioners, we've been committed to race equality in the broader inclusion agenda. And hopefully a lot of you have been part of that and are talking about this regularly in your teams. We've done a lot around this. However, we still recognise there is a lot to do with this, and we are a national outlier in relation to, particularly in relation to appointment and shortlisting ratios. So this is a really good opportunity for us to hear from Roger and to learn from some of the things he said and the work he is doing. So hopefully we get this opportunity to really speak to him and learn from what work we are doing, and really shape the plans that we are doing and the actions that we have. So Roger, I just wanted to hear from you in a second, but before I do, I just want to set out for those who may not know Roger. He is a research fellow at the Middlesex University Business School, and has previously worked across 8 trade unions at senior level and played a significant role in developing the NHS workforce race equality standard. He's produced a large body of research on equality, including the recent the Snowy White Peaks of the NHS, and he's an unpaid director of Patients First. He presented comprehensive evidence to the 2015 Francis Speak Out review on bullying in the NHS and the treatment of black and minority ethnic whistleblowers. His other publications include the 2021 research report called No More Tick Boxes, which Roger provides a summary of some of the research evidence of fair recruitment and career progression. And what I would say is, if you haven't had an opportunity to see those, please do so. So, Roger, do you want to just say hello, and then we'll get into some of the conversation and the questions that I have for you. You're on mute, Roger.
Yeah, sorry. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the introduction. And yeah, just to say, I'm giving up on doing formal presentations because of death by PowerPoint. So I just thought it'd be more challenging, but more interesting to have it as a conversation. I'm looking forward to it.
Brilliant. So, Roger, to kick it off, so I mentioned Snowy White Peaks, and it's been instrumental and influential in helping the NHS to understand where we failed collectively in terms of race equality. For those who aren't familiar about it, could you summarise what it covers?
So, in 2013, don't ask me why, I was reading through the minutes of something called the NHS Commissioning Board, which later became NHS England. And there was some data in there on race appointments to senior positions. And when I dug into the minutes they referred to, I couldn't believe what they were showing. That virtually no black and minority ethnic staff have been appointed to senior positions in the early days of NHS England. So I went looking on the assumption that somewhere there were reports that kind of explained what was happening and so on. I think the first thing I found was there were no reports. The issue was not being discussed. There had been a 2004 report called the Race Equality Action Plan, which ministers have backed, which was the NHS's response to Macpherson and the report on institutional racism in the Metropolitan Police. But there was no openness. There was very little discussion. When I wrote to London boards, I thought that would be a good place to start. Lots of NHS staff in London. A number of them refused to say what the ethnicity of their boards was. And I said, well, I've got pictures of all of them. I've got their names, so I'm going to take a guess, and I'm going to report you to the Information Commissioner. How can you not disclose the ethnicity of your board members when you expect your staff to do the same? And that process of avoidance and denial, I think, was the dominant thing that I came across. I met a very senior group of chief nurses, and when I presented the data, at the time I was writing it, the most senior one said, well, I don't think I accept your data. I said, well, the data was provided by the minister following a briefing by the chief nurse. It's not my data, it's your data. Why don't you know it? So that just gives you the flavour. I think we moved a long way since then, but in those days, it was clear there was something going on with an ethnicity gradient, just nursing. There were virtually no nurses in senior positions above 8D, virtually none. So kind of that was the challenge. And I said organisations weren't even acknowledging their own data. And finally, there was no understanding really of the connection between how you treat your staff and what sort of services you provide. Something that we kind of now take, I think, for granted, that this is not about compliance, it's about improvement. I think in those days it was seen as, oh, equality officers were compliance officers, risk officers, they weren't improvement people. So we've moved away from that to a considerable degree, but we still have a long way to go.
Sorry, Roger, technical difficulties, as you can imagine. on that, we've got a long way to go. What progress do you think has made since then? So that was 2013. What progress do you think it was made, and where are we now, would you say? I said we've got a long way to go, and we keep saying that, but where is the destination we're trying to get to, and how far along that road have we really got?
So if you start with progress, there are now more people of BME heritage in more senior positions. Not enough, but there are more people there. We've made significant progress, if you look at the data, on the relative likelihood of Black and minority ethnic staff entering the disciplinary process. So since 2017, the number of disciplinaries in the NHS has dropped by 28%. And the gap between the likelihood of Black and white staff entering the disciplinary process has been more than halved. And that's because evidenced interventions came along, which I can talk about later if you like, but in essence said the way we've been doing things was never going to work. We need to do it differently. What does the research say? What we haven't done is to do that with recruitment and career progression. And if you look at the data on recruitment and career progression, now it's no different to what it was 5 years ago. It's 1.61 times more likely that even after shortlisting, a white person will be appointed by an interview panel compared to someone who is of Black and minority ethnic heritage. So that's the challenge. I think that there is one other important difference, and I think it's the result of Black Lives Matter, the understanding eventually during COVID that BME staff were particularly at risk. So I go into quite a lot of boards. Previously, I was often asked, why is this so important? Why should we focus on this? I am never asked that now. What I'm asked is, how do we do it? And I think that is a step forward. The problem's been that there's been very little work done to look at whether the things that we do are ones that are likely to work, which is why I wrote No More Tick Boxes, because the more I read the literature, the more I realized the gap between what trusts with good intention were trying to do, what CCGs with good intention were trying to do, and the likelihood of happening, making the progress they wanted to make. There was a big gap. So that's what that report is about. And it does really call for a pretty complete overhaul of how we do recruitment and career progression.
So just on that, can you tell us a little bit more about No More Tick Boxes in terms of what are the key recommendations within that? So what I'm hearing is that you see the recruitment and retention is the key area of focus we need to now focus on. But how do we do it? What are the recommendations that you have that we should really move this forward?
So I start with two questions.
Yeah.
If I was a medical director reporting to you that what our intervention was going to be on MRSA, for example, you would expect me to be able to say why I had confidence that what I was proposing to do had a reasonable likelihood of working. In other words, it was evidenced. You just don't do that on race. If you ask people why do you put so many people through unconscious bias training, what's the evidence it actually makes a difference to decision making? Nobody knows, but actually there's loads of evidence that the relationship between training and decision making is very thin. It's not to say there shouldn't be training, but if you think that's what's going to change decision making, it's not true. So what the report does, it starts with that principle and starts with another principle, which is that on average, over time, the likelihood of men and women, because the report is about gender and disability as well as about race, men and women, Black and white staff, being appointed once they're shortlisted should be about the same. That's the second principle. And so boards need to, so what are the principles that boards need to do? The first thing is they have to do what Mary Dixon Woods calls adopt a problem sensing approach to data, not a comfort seeking one. You know, where are the outliers? What's going on here? Why has that happened? If we looked at the data in a different way, does it show a different picture? So the first is the data. The second is bias is really deep inside all of us, including me. So we need to be aware of that and recognise that's a key obstacle to fair recruitment. The bias takes all sorts of forms. I can illustrate it in a moment, perhaps, but it takes all sorts of forms. Everything from you tend to appoint people like you tend to appoint people you think will fit in. You have views about what merit is, what the best is, whether people, and so on. Colleagues will be familiar with that. BME colleagues will have experienced it. If you went back 30, 40 years, women used to, they still experience to some degree, but 30, 40 years ago, it was like, we don't need women. You didn't see many women positions. So leaders need to understand their own assumptions, behaviors, stereotypes, and biases. We need to understand that quality, diversity, and inclusion is not just about compliance. It's primarily about improvement. It's a big change in mindset. And we need to have, I think, 3 principles that should guide what we do. The first is, rather than focusing primarily on de-biasing people, we need to de-bias processes. And I can sort of illustrate that in a moment, if that's helpful. We need to insert accountability. People who are scrutinized change their behavior. And we need to recognize that simply getting people, more diverse people into leadership in itself won't bring about the change we want to make unless we make them inclusive, because they will move on. They will not be able to bring the difference they bring and create the diversity of thought that we need at that level. So de-biasing processes, not just de-biasing people, accountability in all sorts of different ways, and understanding that it's not enough just to have a few different people in senior positions. We have to create an inclusive environment. Otherwise, they will quite rightly either move on or disengage.
That sounds fantastic, Roger. But what I was saying, it'd be quite challenging to give us really practical examples of bringing it to life of how we do that. So de-biasing processes, the accountability, and the inclusive environment. How do we actually do that across the NHS? Both there's the national part, there's the system-wide, but then there's also the hyper-local, isn't there? How do we do that at every level?
So yesterday I met with colleagues from Barts, and this morning I met with colleagues from the Royal Free. And what's really interesting in both those organisations, they are starting to do some of the things that need to do. Let me give you some examples. If you create a job and you have loads and loads of essential criteria, that is going to deter, there's lots of research on this, that will deter some groups of people from applying, because they won't apply for jobs unless they're reasonably confident they can do it all. Which groups of people are they? They are women, and they are black and minority staff who on the whole will only apply for jobs where they're pretty confident they can do most of it. People like you and me, we're quite happy to apply for jobs. I don't want to get personal here, Tom. We're quite happy to apply for jobs that we can't do, because in my case, I have 5,000 years of, if you like, positive discrimination behind me, which gives me a confidence that I can deal with it, and I'm not worried about making mistakes. But if you're being constantly pushed back and you know you're going to be held to a higher standard, so think really carefully about setting loads of essential criteria, because that will deter people. How you advertise jobs, is it sort of macho, weird, challenging? Because that's going to put women off in particular, black women. And you can go through the entire cycle of career development and recruitment and identify from research all sorts of things that will have the effect of discriminatory practice and enabling all the biases that we have to come to life. So if we don't have, when we shortlist, if we don't have really clear criteria about what we're looking for, a pretty good idea of the sorts of answers we expect people to make, and a clear scoring system, and stick to it, we're going to end up at the end of the day with people saying, well, Roger had a really bad interview, but I've seen him in action. He's really good. That's the point, Roger. You can't do that. Linked to that, the evidence is if you have more than one data point for recruitment, in other words, you have an interview and you maybe have a situational judgment test or a work sample, or you meet or they have to meet a group of staff that they're going to manage and be judged by them. Those sorts of things together are much more likely to get an accurate, predictive, fair result than just relying on an interview, which is very open to bias. And then there's what selection process is, how you score, how you conduct the interview. So there's quite a lot of evidence that within 4 minutes of you walking into an interview panel, the panel's taken a view about who you are and whether you're appointable. And of course, if you are black, and to some degree if you are female, and particularly actually if you're disabled, you spend the rest of the interview trying to persuade people that despite the fact you're black, female or disabled, you are the person they should appoint. That doesn't apply to somebody like me on the whole. So you could go through each stage thinking about those sorts of things. But I'll give a small example from a piece of research that wasn't my research, but I published the case study yesterday. Nurse recruitment. So a big teaching hospital in London had really clunky recruitment processes. It streamlined them and ended the situation for new bulk nurse recruitment, where the future line manager will be the person who chose who was recruited. They got rid of that, not for equality reasons, but because it was a completely clunky process. So then you were just recruited as a nurse to XYZ Trust, and then you were allocated either immediately or within a few months to the specialism you wanted to go to. The act of removing the future line manager from the final decision in who was going to be appointed almost eliminated discrimination. Got the data, 6 months data compared with 6 months previously.
Wow.
Really interesting, and there's not an obvious other explanation. So in terms of so debiasing processes in all those sorts of ways is very helpful. The other thing is accountability. So I always suggest 4 things. When you look at appraisals, start monitoring what sort of what sort of ratings are people getting when they get appraisals, because women tend to do not so well in appraisals compared to men, and BME staff do particularly badly compared to white staff. You should have a bell curve with an equal distribution, but you rarely do. So the first thing is, what's the data say? If it doesn't show a reasonably sort of shared experience, the leadership in the organization want to know why. There might be a really good explanation for it. I suspect there isn't. So that's the first one, appraisals. The next one is stretch opportunities. Research is clear. Opportunities to act up, be seconded, take part in significant projects are the most important thing in people developing their careers. But we know that the access to them is generally informal, not monitored, often a tap on the shoulder. You pull in people you like or people you make assumptions about. And that's what enables some people to move on and some people to just disengage. So stop that. No more informal access to stretch opportunities. They're treated as if they were mini jobs, and they are monitored. And if the access to them is different between men and women, black and white staff, we want to know why, and it's got to change. We will help people to change, but it's got to change. The third one is, what do panels do? So the Royal Free have a system. It's for the panel to decide who to appoint. But if a BME person is shortlisted and not appointed, the panel chair has to put in writing why they appointed the person they did, why they didn't appoint the person they didn't, and what steps they are taking to make sure that the BME colleague that was shortlisted does better next time. And that's monitored. And if it keeps happening to you, you don't want a phone call from the HR director or the chief exec saying, or the director of nursing saying, sorry, it's me again, it's happened again. So, and the final and fourth thing is what's very common in organizations is data-driven accountability. Because it's really, there's always a good reason why I got appointed rather than, say, Nikki. But if it happens 10 times, it's very unlikely there's a good reason. So data-driven accountability is very common in nursing and medicine. Dashboards used all the time to look for outliers and patterns. We have to use that around equality. And when there are patterns of disproportionality, we call the people in, the managers in, and we say, this is what appears to have happened. Is there a good reason? If there isn't, and there generally won't be, it's got to change. It will change. It's going to become part of your KPIs and so on, but we will help you change as well. So it's not a case of beating people up, but it is a case of saying, we're watching you and it's got to change. And the evidence is that starts to change the way people behave. So those four things: appraisals, structure opportunities, panels, and overall data. I've got a meeting just after this with a very, very big trust where they've agreed to do all four of those things. And I'm fairly confident, because the research says it will work, that will make the difference. The problem is we've done all sorts of things and we've got no idea whether they're going to work. Whereas we now have, with these things, we know we have research that says done properly and in combination, they will make a difference.
That's incredibly interesting. And I think a lot of us can recognise some of the things that you've touched upon, and many people on the call would have experienced a number of things you've touched upon. Just going into the last point you made previously about an inclusive environment. So there is a national focus on making sure there is diverse leadership, particularly around how organisations and systems work in the future. But you went beyond that, didn't you? It's not just about a diverse leadership. This is about an inclusive environment which has a sustainability and has a longevity to it. How do we create that inclusive environment?
The first thing is, research says, if leaders don't believe in it, it won't happen. So leaders have to understand why this is important. And one or two colleagues may be familiar, because they may have heard me rattle on about this before. There's a lovely piece of exercise done by Google called Project Aristotle, which tried to understand which of their teams were more effective and why. And what they found really surprised them. They found that what made for an effective team was less the quality, whether you had the best individuals in that team, and more how they communicated with each other and treated each other. So the best teams weren't made up of 10 A-star appointments. They were made up of a mix of people, and the key was, how did they talk to each other? Did they respect each other? Was it a safe place? Well, this is psychological safety, where you could say, Tom, I don't agree with you, without thinking, oh, well, my next appraisal is going to be a car crash. So when you do that, teams are more innovative, they're more creative, they're more productive, they're a safer place, there's more discretionary effort, there's less turnover. They were amazed at what they found. So it's when you can create that, you have there's really strong evidence that it makes for better teams. What doesn't make for better teams is to chuck lots of different people together and just assume that somehow or other diversity will make for a better team. It need not. It might be the opposite. It just creates loads of conflict. So you have to work at it. But the great thing is that the reason it's worth working at it is because diverse teams will be safer teams, where people are more willing to admit mistakes, they feel safer to raise concerns. They will say to each other, are you sure you've done that right? Rather than say to somebody afterwards, I thought they were the right mess of that, So there's a very powerful patient care argument in favour of something that is also a really good way of hanging on to and building the confidence of diverse people. And there are ways of doing this. Don't set people with too many objectives. Really think consciously about, you want people to bring their difference into work, because it's the difference that adds the value. A safe place to challenge. And there are ways of measuring this. There's a number of different ways of measuring it, but it can be done. But the key is, do the leadership model those behaviours, and do they believe it can work? Because if they do believe it can work, they can make it happen. And if they don't, people will say, well, they're not. Why should we?
Absolutely. So last question before I then open it to the floor for some questions. So we've talked about some of the what you're talking about is big sort of sometimes institutional structural change and long-term future change. But in terms of the very, very short term, so a lot of people on the call, we've got the commitment with people on the call, outside the call. What's the one takeaway that we should go away that we can do after the call is finished or tomorrow that's going to really make the difference? What's the one thing for you to really get this moving and make progress from now on?
I'm going to be a bit cheeky and say two things. One is you need to demonstrate by doing something significant that the organisation is serious. And I would suggest that in some ways the easiest, because you can do it quickly, is to think really carefully about how you handle stretch opportunities. And I know there's work going on locally around that. So you create talent pools, you kind of formalise entry into that, and you also check how people are being treated within it. So that's one thing. I think the other thing is, particularly for white colleagues, is to think really carefully about what our responsibility is. And I think we have two main responsibilities. The first is stop putting forward or agreeing things unless we can be reasonably confident why we're doing it, that it's got a chance of working. I must have looked at, I don't know, certainly at least 100 action plans on race in the last couple of years. And to be honest, although most of them are underpinned by good intentions, they're largely noise. Because each year it hasn't made much difference, and there's no discussion about why. Allow that with any other issue within a trust or within a CCG. So think about as allies. Don't allow people to do stuff that hasn't got a reasonable likelihood of working. And I don't know if you've seen that lovely. I'm reminded of it because I was with him for the first time ever last night. John Amici has a lovely video in which he talks about the difference between someone who's not a racist and somebody who's anti-racist. Is that at the time, in the moment, they challenge things that are not right, and that's not always easy. And he says you don't have to kind of throw the turkey off the kind of table, but you have to make it clear that I don't agree with that. I don't think that's right. Do you realise what you've just said? Because it shouldn't be left to people who are subjected to discrimination to be the prime people who challenge it. So that's for white colleagues. And for everybody, it's to say, why is the organisation doing things if you don't know whether they're going to work?
That is certainly food for thought, and I think there's a challenge for us all there, and I think it's relevant for everyone on this call. I'm going to throw it open to some questions in the chat, or do put your hand up, colleague, if you're happy to, if you're comfortable to ask a question. And I'll bring in Nikki and Chris to help with this if we need to. So the first one up, Terry, you've got your hand up.
I have, yeah. Thanks, Roger. Really, really helpful perspective and a challenge for us all, I think. I just wanted to ask on the recruitment side of things, what your view was on a couple of things, really. Firstly, about kind of positive discrimination, and also about, because I know many organisations, certainly when I've worked in the civil service previously, we've tried things like ensuring there is always someone from a BAME background on a panel to help counter that kind of bias point. Just interested on your kind of perspectives on kind of those points, really.
So you raised a really interesting point, because what the civil service has done is what pretty much everybody did. So everybody went around saying, right, we'll have diverse panels. So if you go hunting for the research that says putting somebody different on a panel will make a decisive difference to the outcome, there is no such research. There's no such research. I'm not against, in fact, I'm in favour of diverse panels, but only if they're part of a wider process. So, for example, there's no point in putting a junior BME person on a panel with a more senior white person who's their line manager, or even a more senior person within the department. There's no point in putting them on the panel unless it's safe for them, they feel it's safe for them to say something. So, for example, West London Mental Health Trust had a system whereby the chair of the panel was told, the BME person on the panel has been trained to do X, Y, and Z, and they are required to report to me if there's anything that goes on that they're concerned about. Now, you might think that's a bit like having a police informer on the panel, but it worked. So I said to the HR director, you know, did that create a lot of problems? She said, no, it didn't create any problem because everybody knew they didn't want a phone call from me. So, but the other thing about putting people on panels, it's a classic example of what the NHS does all the time. It looks for silver bullets. It thinks if we do this, it'll make a difference. So I know, for example, I shouldn't know, but I know that within NHS England's recent huge restructure, that's what they did. And their own data shows it made a difference of 0.6% to the likelihood of BME staff being appointed. That's the difference. You could have done a lot more, made a lot more difference doing other things. Training is another thing. So there's two sorts of training. There's general training. I mean, the online EDI training in the NHS, just dump it. It's a complete waste of time. Training can be helpful. Unconscious bias training can be very helpful, can make us realize, can make us much more receptive to the sorts of things that I've talked about. But on its own, it doesn't change decision making. If you look at the EHRC literature review on unconscious bias training done in 2018, its conclusion is, in fact, I summarized the conclusion in no more tick boxes. There is no robust evidence linking unconscious bias training to changes in decision making. So it will make you more open to thinking about these things, but doesn't necessarily lead to any change. Done with other things, it can make a difference. So I'm in favour of it, but as long as people are clear what it can and can't do. So positive discrimination, of course, is unlawful. Positive action isn't, and I'm in favour of it. So giving support for BME staff around interview training, all sorts of things like that can be helpful, but they're not a substitute for debiasing the processes and inserting accountability. I remember an early conversation, again, actually with Barts, where they were doing lots of work on this. And I said, you are wasting your time unless you address the institutional barriers, because actually people are going to be really cheesed off. You're going to put them through all this encouragement and they're going to have the same results when they get to the interview. It's going to be counterproductive. They're going to go off and get jobs elsewhere. You've helped them to get jobs elsewhere. They're not going to get jobs here. So avoid silver bullets and look at what's likely to work. And you know, the kind at the heart of this, I'll just finish on this. At the heart of this, we have a sort of, I'll call it an HR paradigm, which is that if we put in place policies, procedures, and training, that sets the standard, what we expect, and it makes it safe for people to challenge decision making. But there's no evidence that in isolation, policies and procedures can change organizational culture. None at all. Lots of evidence that it doesn't. And training, I've just touched on. And if people think, well, I always say to people, I got challenged on this very recently by a chief exec. I said, okay, how many people in your organization, it was a bit embarrassing really, it was in a board meeting, how many people in this trust have challenged a recruitment decision on the grounds they thought it was unfair, had the decision overturned, and been thanked for doing so? Nobody. Occasionally it does happen, but very rarely. So is that model. What I'm doing really is I'm turning it upside down and said, yes, of course we need policies and procedures and training, but actually the big things will be debiasing processes, inserting accountability. And finally, I would say on things beyond recruitment and career progression, things like bullying and discipline, be proactive, have a public health approach, intervene early and informally, rather than say to people, if you've got a problem, lodge a grievance. It's a complete waste of time. It's just, it's a death wish for everybody. It's a death wish for management. It's a death wish for the person concerned.
Thanks, Roger, and thanks, Terry, for the question. There is a question I wanted to address. I think you've covered a lot of this, Roger, but I do just want to pick out just in case, because there's a question from Rita who asked quite early on about to promote workforce race equality in the workplace. what would be your top 3 suggestions for us as an organisation, and what would be your top 3 suggestions for us as individuals? And then the other question is, you touched upon training, what would be your thoughts on compulsory educational training for members of the organisation on this matter? I think you set out you quite clearly what your opinion was on training, but I'm just interested around that compulsory part. Does that make any difference whatsoever?
Well, the research strongly suggests that mandatory training on EDI can be counterproductive. You have to persuade people that they want to do it. If you don't, there's a lovely paper, big American paper, that says that mandatory training, diversity training, is the least effective way of increasing the proportion of women and BME people in more senior positions. So I am in favour of everybody having training, but if you bully people into going, they will come out of it and they'll start waffling about political correctness and blah blah blah. You have to kind of, if people don't want to change and keep making discriminatory decisions, that's a management issue. There's an OD issue here about how you help people change. Training can be helpful and it should be offered to everybody, and people should be strongly encouraged to do it. But it doesn't work. I mean, there's nothing worse. I don't do a lot, but I do some training. There's nothing worse than being in a room where 3 or 4 people really, really, really don't want to be there, because it just wrecks it for everybody. So mandatory training, that will be my view. On the more general issue, I think 3 things. First is, leaders have to go through uncomfortable conversations where we acknowledge our part in allowing discrimination, all forms of discrimination, but particularly race discrimination to happen. It's pretty well rooted in our history. And we have to think through we have to have honest conversations about what has been our part in that, how's that affected how we think, how we behave, often not consciously racist, but just all sorts of assumptions in our heads that affect how we work. So we have to change. We have to think and try and talk our way through that. And that face-to-face discussion with skilled trainers can be very helpful around that. That's the first thing. Because if the leaders don't believe in it, it's really hard to make it happen. Second thing is, as I said, pick the issue. I would suggest in Sussex, maybe the big issue is recruitment and retention. You know better than me, but if it is, work out 2 or 3 things to do straight away that will persuade Black and minority ethnic staff that you're serious about the issue, because there will be some fairly quick returns on it, without pretending that some of this will take quite a while to do. And I've touched on some of the things that I think people can do around that. I do think the third thing is white people acknowledging that our experience is different. I don't get followed around shops. If I walk into a shop, I don't get followed around with people seeing if I'm shoplifting. That's a common experience. But if I'm, I don't have to. Well, actually, my daughters are mixed race, so I did. But normally, white families don't worry about whether their children are going to be stopped on their way home for no good reason. These are quite common experiences of people, and we need to recognise that's what happens. And if we see it at work, we have to intervene. And if I end with just one example of a real white allyship, some of you may remember the case. Wigan, Wrightington and Lee Trust in the Northwest. A patient came in and wanted to see a white doctor. The junior doctor said, "Oh, I don't think we do that here." Went to the consultant and says, "No, we don't do that." Saw the patient, said, "No, you'll get the doctor you need, unless there's a good clinical reason for it." So there might be sometimes good clinical reasons why a woman wants to see a female doctor. But he said, "I can think of no good reason why you need to see a white doctor." So he got treated, went away, and then was on the front page of the local paper, complaining bitterly about political correctness in the trust. The chief executive immediately demanded the right of reply, and next week on the front page of the local paper said this, I'm paraphrasing, but it's pretty much what he said. If you turn up to our hospital in future, we will give you emergency care and we will send you off to somewhere you can find one that will give you a white doctor. That's not what we do here. We treat our staff with respect. It's utterly undermining to all our staff. Our white and black staff will not accept that. So if you want treatment at our hospital beyond their emergency care, you need to change your attitude. Well, you can imagine for black staff in that trust, that was right. That's leadership at the moment, in a way that, and of course he got racist abuse for this, but Andrew Foster stood his ground, and white staff were very supportive to him as well. So that a simple act like that is sometimes worth much more than all sorts of other things. So acting as an active ally, and if you're in a leadership position, deal with it properly. Next organisation, I'll finish with this. Next organisation I'm going to, chief executive. It's not a trust that has a good track record on this. New chief exec. First board meeting I went to about 6 months ago, in the middle of kind of talking about what I was suggesting I might do, said, and another thing he said, I do never want to hear again in this organisation anybody describing anyone else as an angry black woman. As far as I'm concerned, that's serious, gross misconduct, and we will not tolerate it. And it starts with the board. Well, something's gone on here. That sends out a message, and I think there's quite a lot of that going on. That's changed in the last 2 or 3 years. So that'd be my 3 things.
That's brilliant, Roger. And I just wanted to make the point, just for those who are on the call, you might have seen some, particularly when you're talking about some of the training in education, there's some wry smiles probably from colleagues on the call. I just want to make the point, that's not because people think this is funny or amusing. This is a very extremely serious subject. This is because we are enjoying your candor. We're enjoying hearing it how it is. This is an uncomfortable conversation for us all, organisationally and probably individually on the call. That is why we're having it. So that is the purpose of it. So I just wanted to make that point. People aren't smirking or whatever because we think this is funny. This is extremely serious, but we're really enjoying your candor and you telling us how it is, because this is incredibly insightful. I just wanted to make that point so there wasn't any confusion. We've got time for a couple more questions, and then unfortunately we will have to round this off. But personally, I don't know about you, but I could listen to Roger all day, but you've probably got something else. Remy.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Roger, for everything. It's been very insightful. I know a lot of work and focus has been on recruitment and selection lately. For example, the NHS recruitment and selection pilot program, for example, talent program as well. Those are good examples. But then shouldn't there be the same focus or more focus on retention as well, creating the right inclusive environment that help develop and help grow this talent so that they are retained within the system and not just be like a tick box exercise, because we know that bringing in these BIM colleagues into the system help boost the rest report, for example, but then them going out through the back door same time doesn't really help anybody as well.
So it's a good reason a good question for 2 reasons. The first reason is that when I created the RES in 2014, in the draft, it included retention. And you have no idea, well, maybe you do, the resistance there was to bring in any kind of nationally mandated monitoring of what was going on. And eventually, the only way to get this through was to reduce the number of indicators from 10 to 9 on the grounds that if it didn't go into double figures, there would be less of an issue around it. There are also issues about what the government was going to do with it. So the one that got knocked out was retention. Actually, quite a lot of trusts I don't know about CCGs, but a lot of trusts actually do monitor turnover by ethnicity. And I'm very much in favour of it for the reason you said. If you're a chief exec, you ought to be as interested, as you've said, in if you have data coming in all the time. What a good leader does is to kind of constantly triangulate the data to say, do you know what, down in this department, something is going on. There are higher than expected sickness levels, higher than expected turnover levels. Something is wrong in this bit of the organization. We're going down there to find out. And it's usually linked with bullying and bad management. But specifically, and particularly at more senior levels, there's no national, I mean, I'm arguing at the moment about that there should be. There's no clear national monitoring of turnover of BME staff. But I know anecdotally that in organizations which are not inclusive, the turnover of BME staff is higher than the turnover of white staff. For obvious reasons, you don't feel included, you're not respected, your contribution is not invited and valued. So my view is there's nothing to stop organizations monitoring turnover by ethnicity. Quite a lot of organizations already do. I'd be in favor of it being done nationally. I don't know if that's going to happen. But in any case, it should be something you publicly disclose, because it's then one of the issues you can discuss with those teams or departments where there is a higher turnover, because you can be sure as eggs is eggs, something's going on there.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you, Roger. So I'm last question to Ogo.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Tom, and thank you, Roger, for really insightful discussion. I wanted to ask if you could elaborate a bit on examples of positive action and how it can be implemented successfully to redress inequalities in the NHS workforce.
So with the sort of caveat that I said earlier, that if you, alongside positive action, if you don't also challenge the institutional barriers, positive action can be very helpful. So the sorts of things you can do is most obviously open up stretch opportunities, and particularly create talent pool, which I think Chris is, I'm kind of bullying Chris to finish what he's doing, because I'm really keen on those linked to stretch opportunities. No reason for stretch opportunities to not be a form of positive action. In fact, it'll be the most valuable sort. The second thing is to give encouragement. You know, depending on who you are, you either get a lot of informal encouragement or you don't. And it ranges on everything from body language to time and the sorts of practice. You know, are you encouraged to go on courses? Are you encouraged to go for jobs? What specific support do you get? Is there any mentoring? So mentoring can be very helpful. Be cautious. Mentoring can also be a troublesome place unless you address the fact. So there's lovely research that shows that if white people mentoring black people don't think about how they're doing this and what the purpose is and how it's perceived, what you end up with is white people mentoring is much more about building their networks and their confidence and so on. Black people's mentoring becomes more technical knowledge, and it's the former that gives you the better chances of getting jobs. So it's about all different sorts of encouragement. I'll just give a kind of another example. When I was the advisor to the National Aspiring Directors Programme, with my colleague Doyen Etewalagan, we set a principle which we eventually got agreed, which is unless the proportions of women and BME staff who were recruited to this aspiring directors program were representative of the proportions of people in the pools that they came from, recruitment would stop. And we would go out again until we got the same proportion of women and the same proportion of BME staff in the applications as there should be based upon their proportion within the pool from which they came. What happened? Chief execs, for the first time in their lives, were ringing up BME staff on HC and AD and saying, have you ever thought of being an aspiring director? You really ought to think about going on this program. 3 of the women said to me, it was the first time ever anybody senior had come up to them and said, have you thought about going for this job? So we need to put in place, if you like, incentives and nudges, behavioural nudges, that will be alongside this sort of, the slightly more fluffy stuff about, support for interview training and so on. But getting access to those stretch opportunities, using them as positive action, I think, is a very effective way of bringing people on.
Brilliant. So, Roger, unfortunately, we have to end. We have to end sometime. As I said, I could listen to you all day. Thank you, colleagues, for asking your questions. Well, I just do want to flag, which Nikki has put in the chat, is that this is for CCG colleagues on the call, that Adam's webinar next week will focus on our results and the actions we'll be taking. So do please join Adam's webinar next week. And it just leads me to say, I'm going to give you the last word, Roger, but I just want to say massive thanks for across the CCGs for taking your time to talk to us today. Incredibly insightful, incredibly thought-provoking, and incredibly challenging as well. So thank you for putting us in that space and making us uncomfortable and really thinking about ourselves and others and what we need to do to improve this. But over to you for the last word.
Onwards and upwards, really. I mean, I think we have to agree that we've made some progress. The fact that we're talking about it is progress, and talking about it in the way that we weren't 3 or 4 years ago. But we have to be honest about we have a big mountain to climb. Don't do things unless you have some confidence that what you're proposing to do has some reasonable likelihood of working, because going down that avenue is absolutely soul destroying. It just means there's a lot of noise but no outcome. And I have to say, fairly recently I've been rather critical of 1 or 2 initiatives from the national office that to me have that flavour. In other words, lots of activity, but why do you think this is going to work? And I think it's great you're having, people having these conversations. I've done lots of these, and they are definitely, they're in a definitely better place than they were 3 or 4 years ago, where people were really quite, it was even more challenging than it is now. And I see one of the faces I recognise. Hi, Tanya. I don't know why you popped up on my screen, but hi.
Thank you, Roger. Thanks everyone for taking the time to join us today. I hope you found it useful, and do please engage with the other Black History Month events that we've got planned across the month. So on that, have a great rest of the day. Thank you again, Roger, and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.